This new GTX 580 is up to 81% better than NVIDIA's technologically outdated RTX 5080. And this is, it's not new, it's from 2010. But it's suddenly relevant again. We even brought back this GTX 980. Here it is running against the $1,000+ RTX 5080 from 2025. The 980 is a better gaming experience than the 5080 in some of these tests today. We even dug Mirror's Edge out of the grave for this, surviving an onslaught of EA Origin pop-ups to do so. You can see a similar here. The 5080 struggles versus older hardware. In fact, we even put the RTX 5080 with a GTX 980 together as an accelerator card to improve the performance. And all of that is because of what's on the screen now. The way it's meant to be played. NVIDIA's old slogan, where the company said that PhysX was a graphics feature that would change the way the games looked and felt. And they were right, especially when they stopped supporting it. A couple weeks ago, a user responded to an NVIDIA driver feedback thread saying that, quote, PhysX still isn't working on the 50 series cards, attempting to force it on via a config file edit in Borderlands 2, and turning on the PhysX indicator shows it's running on the CPU, end quote. In response, NVIDIA stated that, quote, this is expected behavior as 32-bit CUDA applications are deprecated on the GeForce RTX 50 series GPUs, end quote, citing a post from January 17th that had, up until then, drawn little attention from the gaming community. This is an insight into what happens when vendor-specific solutions are abandoned. And even though the affected games are ancient, it breathes some healthy skepticism back into topics like vendor-specific graphics improvements. So today, we have a lot of those. DLSS and its many sub-features, things like FG, frame generation, multi-frame generation, DLAA, reflex, any number of these special features that they're pushing. And the same goes for other companies like AMD. And even ray tracing. There's no guarantee that ray tracing continues to work the way it does today with the fixed hardware that we have in GPUs today. That stuff could change. And what we're looking at today with PhysX 32-bit support on these ancient games is an insight into that world. So let's get into the PhysX situation. Before that, this video is brought to you by the Montech Hyperflow series of liquid coolers. The Montech Hyperflow aims to compete with other affordable liquid coolers by fighting on price to performance. In our testing, cooler performance was comparable to others in its class. The ARGB Hyperflow has an illuminated pump block with RGB LED fans that have quality rubber bumpers for vibration damping. The cooler has a 6-year warranty and supports all modern Intel and AMD sockets, and you can learn more at the link in the description below. Rumors of its demise are slightly exaggerated, not greatly. NVIDIA, at this point, hasn't fully killed PhysX. Not yet, anyway. And what they have killed is 32-bit CUDA support. And by extension, that means that 32-bit PhysX games are affected. A user on the Reset Era forum has compiled a list of 32-bit games with PhysX based on a WikiLists article. And big thanks to those guys for rescuing lists from rules-obsessed Wikipedia editors and their crusade to convert every list into a useless categories page. Yes, this bothers us. It'll be a separate video. If with enough likes, we'll do that video. PhysX has had a long history, and it's not actually gone. For example, newer games with 64-bit PhysX shouldn't be affected. We were particularly confused when researching this story by the February 18th Tom's Hardware article, which claims in the leading statements, quote, as far as we know, there are no 64-bit games with integrated PhysX technology, end quote. But it then mentions Metro Exodus and The Witcher 3. Both of which are 64-bit games. Further adding to the confusion, PhysX doesn't have to be accelerated on the GPU. It could be done on the CPU, so removing GPU acceleration doesn't necessarily completely kill the feature in games. In order to better explain the situation, we first need to redefine what PhysX is, or what it was trying to be. It was part of NVIDIA's SDK suite for developers. And what NVIDIA said it was trying to do on that was make it easier to integrate high-quality physical effects in games. The downside was that it'd run either exclusively or minimally just better on NVIDIA hardware. This is a familiar story even to today. NVIDIA with these features has historically also driven integration by providing engineering resources to developers. So back with the GameWorks stuff, one of the things NVIDIA was doing was sending engineers out to different game developer campuses to help them program and integrate features in their games. And while they were there, sometimes they'd even optimize the drivers. So this was all a part of NVIDIA's relationships with developers. It was really focusing on them back then. To paraphrase Wikipedia, PhysX was originally developed by Novodex AG, which was acquired by Aegea in 2004, which was acquired by NVIDIA in 2008. It originally ran on a discrete PPU, or physics processing unit. These were accelerator cards. But NVIDIA adapted the tech to run on CUDA, and specifically CUDA cores. We're only concerned with NVIDIA PhysX titles here. Pre-2008 games from the AGEA era already required the PhysX legacy installer, and we're not going to go far enough down the rabbit hole to test whether that still works. PhysX is a physics engine SDK, usually associated with destructible environments, ragdolls, fluid, fabric, interactive fog, and particles in general. NVIDIA's tagline for games it collaborated on in the heyday of PhysX was the way it's meant to be played, and PhysX was the poster child for that philosophy. Games like Mafia II look dramatically different with PhysX enabled. They even put NVIDIA's name on the cars that get shot to pieces and blown up in the benchmarking scene. That's an interesting message to send. NVIDIA worked with the developers to turn the NVIDIA experience into literally the way it's meant to be played. If you turn off PhysX in games like Mirror's Edge, it straight up removes objects from scenes. If you were using AMD, or God forbid, Intel graphics in 2010, you were getting inferior versions of the highest profile AAA games. And that was before they invented quadruple A games. Yeah, I'm never gonna forget when they said that. PhysX can be run on CPUs, but typically not well, which gives NVIDIA a big advantage with PhysX. And all of this is kind of an old topic, but again, it becomes relevant today for all the reasons we're talking about, plus some big ones in the conclusion. David Cantor, who has appeared on the channel many times as a technical analyst and helped us with our Intel Fab Tour deep dive, actually wrote about what is happening today 15 years ago. And so, David, you finally get your I told you so moment for NVIDIA. It took 15 years, but you do finally get to say I told you so. As David Cantor said in 2010, quote, "The sole purpose of PhysX is a competitive differentiator to make NVIDIA's hardware look good and sell more GPUs." He complains that, quote, "PhysX uses an exceptionally high degree of x87 code and no SSE, which is a known recipe for poor performance on any modern CPU. Even the highest performance CPUs can only execute 2 x87 operations per cycle," end quote. Meaning that performance will always remain bad, even with 2025 era CPUs. NVIDIA responded to Cantor back then by stating that PhysX 2.x, quote, "dates back to a time when multi-core CPUs were somewhat of a rarity," end quote. NVIDIA noted that it was still possible to implement multi-threading and seems to place the blame on the developers. That hasn't changed at all, actually. That's actually just the same. Further, stating that SSE and multi-threading support would be improved. PhysX 2.8.4, quote, "with the SSE2 option to improve performance in CPU modes," end quote, was released a month after Cantor's post. So he can claim an accomplishment there. And PhysX 3.0 was released in 2011 with, quote, "effective multi-threading." Our understanding is that David Cantor's post back then created quite the firestorm inside of NVIDIA as they tried to figure out how to deal with the bad publicity that was starting to pop up around PhysX and how it might kind of restrict these graphics features behind what was a suboptimal implementation. All of that puts the 32-bit games from the era between a rock and a hard place. And these are games that are now losing GPU acceleration. And as a bonus, they run like absolute shit even on modern CPUs. We've seen games as late as 2014, Borderlands, the pre-sequel, that appear to use PhysX 2.x. In contrast, some more modern post-2.x games like The Witcher 3 don't offer GPU acceleration at all, instead forcing PhysX to always run on the CPU. So if PhysX really did start to prioritize just running on CPUs post 3.0, that would explain why NVIDIA suddenly lost interest. With the release of 3.0, quote, "GPU hardware acceleration in SDK 3.0 is only available for particles or fluids," which helps explain why The Witcher 3 with its PhysX clothing isn't GPU accelerated, although NVIDIA had originally claimed that it would be. And that also hasn't changed. They're still claiming stuff that sometimes just doesn't happen. The last time we thought about PhysX was with NVIDIA Flex in 2014, most notable in our minds for being completely broken in Fallout 4 since the 20 series. There are still engineers tolling away within the NVIDIA Omniverse framework though, with the most recent PhysX release at the time of writing being 5.5.1 from early February this year. We agree with Cantor's analysis of the time and see many parallels to today. It's just that lock-in can become really problematic, and if the hardware vendor suddenly finds out that their solution runs better on other devices, they might just lose interest. We sort of saw this with APO when it first came out, where Intel only supported the CPUs that needed it the least, presumably because those that needed it the most, which were within the same generations and same architecture family, could actually benefit from it in a way that might reduce interest in sales of the higher-end CPUs if it ever took off. Getting into performance testing, we selected 5 32-bit games for testing: Batman, Arkham City, Borderlands 2, Mafia II, Metro Last Light, and Mirror's Edge. We rejected Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag because it has an FPS cap. But more importantly, as AMD owners may already know, you aren't given the option to use PhysX at all without GPU acceleration in that one. This is especially galling because the big PhysX update for Black Flag in 2014 appears to have brought the PhysX version up to 3.3.0. So there's a chance it might not run completely terribly on a CPU if it were allowed to do so. And that brings us to another point, which is that none of the stuff in this video today is news to AMD users, especially of that era. AMD users are used to getting shafted for things like PhysX, where it's just not an option. So for those of you who've been on AMD, you get to now say to owners of $2,000 RTX 5090s, welcome to my world. Maybe a bit of vindication for you. Although it is for games that are 15 years old, but you know, the point stands. So methodologically, determining the PhysX version, judging by the admittedly not very scientific method of inspecting for PhysX by opening the DLLs and control Fing for the different PhysX versions in all the different games, the ones we're testing all appear to be using PhysX 2.x, some version of 2 point something. And remember, the pre-3.0 PhysX games are the ones that are likely to run poorly without GPU acceleration. Those are the ones that'll be the most affected. Mirror's Edge uses 2.8.0. Mafia II and Metro Last Light use 2.8.3. Borderlands 2 and Batman Arkham City use 2.8.4. These last two could therefore have better CPU performance due to the added SSE2 option, depending on the developer's implementation. We used the latest compatible driver for each GPU, which was 572.47 for the 5080 and the 980, and 391.35 March 2018 for the 580. We also used the PhysX system software version that shipped those drivers for each of these cards, so that'd be 9.23.1019 for the newer cards and 9.17.0524 for the 580. All games were run at 1080p on our 9800X 3D GPU test bench. Nothing has changed there, same hardware. G-Sync universally disabled, rebar enabled everywhere possible. The 580, for example, doesn't support it. And then CSM was also enabled by necessity for the 580. Installing the 980 as a secondary GPU pulls 8 lanes from the 5080 in the first slot, so that also could have a small impact. And then the NVIDIA control panel was used to manually align the PhysX processing tasks with the secondary card in those situations, and was also used to assign the processing to each device. And we confirmed that PhysX processing with the 5080 was always performed on the CPU regardless of assignment in these specific games. Now, 64-bit PhysX games should run normally on the 50 series. That should not be affected. That's not what we're testing though. We also didn't test the 980 with CPU PhysX. It was tempting, but outside of the scope. We did it with the 580 though. Comparing PhysX performance is a little tricky because performance depends on the scene. Mirror's Edge runs fine on 50 series cards until broken glass shows up, for example. The benchmarks we've selected here are worst case scenarios that feature heavy PhysX, since that's what we're testing. Let's get into it. Mafia II is up first, mostly because the canned benchmark scene starts with the explosion of 2 cars plated with NVIDIA after they're shot to pieces. It's like they knew this was gonna happen. Mafia II has pros and cons as a test candidate. It was a flagship PhysX title with prominent effects, but on Steam, the original version is now only available as a bundle with the 2020 remaster, which makes it less likely that players will revisit the original. Not everyone was happy with the remake though. Mafia II really went all in with NVIDIA at the time. It uses NVIDIA Apex, which included modular PhysX components like clothing and particles. NVIDIA noted that, quote, when the Apex PhysX setting is at medium or high, the game will utilize both your CPU and a suitable NVIDIA GPU, which doesn't include the 5080. And, quote, clothing effects will always run on the CPU unless you have a second PhysX-capable NVIDIA GPU dedicated solely to PhysX. And finally, quote, Apex clothing effects are the most strenuous aspect of the game, end quote. That could mean that PhysX on the CPU has a chance here. We maxed out the settings and set Apex PhysX to high when enabled X. The Apex clothing effects are obvious if you're looking for them, but really this benchmark is a showcase for rubble, chunks of concrete, glass being blown apart, and wood scattered across the scene with PhysX on. And there's no replacement for them with PhysX off. They just disappear. This is another game where the, we'll call it real experience requires PhysX. Here's the chart. It's insane. With PhysX on, it's actually kind of comical. The RTX 5080 is the worst performer on the chart. That's right, over $1,000 to get worse performance than the GTX 580. Even more insulting than the chart, Mafia II's benchmark concludes with a graded result. You get a letter grade on it. The 5080 got a D. Quote, the performance is not optimal. Please adjust your system settings and run the test again, end quote, is what it told us. And this is coming from a game so old that it thinks that Windows 11 is Windows 7. Believe us, Mafia II, we'd all be happier if that were the case. It averaged 30.3 FPS, with wild variation between individual benchmark passes, showing behavior nearly identical to the GTX 580 when PhysX processing was assigned to the CPU with that card, including the variation between passes. With PhysX processing done on the GPU, the GTX 580 is 85% ahead of the 5080, with improved lows as well. Just to reiterate, this card is 15 years old, and it's outperforming the 5080. The card is old enough to get a driving permit in the US. Now all we need is a card old enough to drink, and we'll finally understand NVIDIA's decision making for January of this year. On the 580, GPU PhysX is 81% ahead of CPU PhysX at 56 to 31 FPS, and CPU PhysX sucks. So far, that lines up with our theory about 2.8.4 onwards being more CPU favorable, since Mafia II appears to be on 2.8.3. Turning PhysX off gives the 5080 a 1,267% improvement to 414 FPS. So it may be worth taking that route if you're stuck with a low-performing 50 series card and you can't afford to upgrade yet to a GTX 580 anytime soon. Of course, if you can upgrade from a 5080 to a GTX 980, there's also room there. It's a 198% improvement. Alternatively, you could travel back to 2006 and add a dedicated PhysX accelerator paired with the 5080. We used a newer GTX 980 as the accelerator in this case, which gave a respectable 441% uplift to 164 FPS average. 0.1% lows were at 60 FPS and made it the best balance of performance and visuals on this chart. NVIDIA has finally achieved what it always wanted. You now need a dedicated Accelerator GPU for PhysX processing. It took them 15 years to do it, but that is what they always want, is more attachment to the board. 2013's Metro Last Light is technically the most recent release on this list, although it's still a 32-bit application, or, as NVIDIA spun it back in 2013, quote, thanks to a highly efficient streaming system, Last Light's world uses less than 4 gigabytes of memory. That's one way to put it. Advanced PhysX is an on or off toggle for all PhysX effects, which NVIDIA categorized as debris and destruction, explosive enhancements, fog volumes, and cloth. We've spent many hours benchmarking Metro Last Light, so for old time's sake, we used our old VHH graphics preset, or very high quality AF4X texture filtering, low motion blur, no SSAA, and high tessellation. This was one of the benchmarks that built GN in the early days. Last Light includes an unusually user-friendly standalone benchmark that lasts 3 minutes without loading screens, which is why we used it so frequently back then. Initially, there's not a dramatic difference with PhysX on versus off until about 2 minutes in. You can see that in the footage here, when explosions and gunfire start to blast chunks of concrete across the scene. Visually, the developers did a fairly good job of making up for the lack of PhysX when the option is disabled, at least in this scene. PhysX helps, but disabling it won't ruin the game. On a GTX 980, it looks great. It's also not bad on a 580. The 5080 is a different story. It's bad. In all tests with the 5080, including the 5080 plus 980 combined test, the animation is bugged out for the train at the beginning of the scene as it comes to a stop. So another of the bugs here for the 50 series. As we can see on this frame time plot, things are okay until the end. Performance ruins the experience and completely tanks on the 5080 and 9800X3D as soon as the PhysX effects kick in. This makes it unplayable. If you watch captured footage of the benchmark, you can see that the sharp spike at the end of the plot makes up a full third of the benchmark chronologically, with frame rates dropping down below 10 FPS for the last minute straight. It doesn't look that way on the chart because of how the frame time chart plots, where the x-axis is frame and the y-axis is milliseconds, but this is a significant portion of the test time. It's just that the time is stretched when it goes this vertical. Note that we're logging the entire benchmark run here, so these bar chart results aren't comparable to our ancient GPU charts. Also, they're probably not comparable because we're not using like a 4790K anymore. The early non-PhysX part of the benchmark helped the 5080 to score relatively high in terms of average frame rate, but the exceptionally poor 1% and 0.1% lows are due to the performance completely falling apart as soon as explosions and gunfire start up. It's totally unplayable, which is unfortunate because NVIDIA said PhysX is the way it's meant to be played. Even the GTX 580 with GPU acceleration coped with this section of the bench better, as indicated by its superior 22.3 FPS 1% and 19.2 FPS 0.1% lows. Watching the benchmark in action makes it clear that the 5080 completely failed this test. The best playable frame rate scored with PhysX was with the 5080 and 980 working together, paying homage to AGEA as it was meant to be. The two averaged 252 FPS with much more reasonable lows. Disabling PhysX on the 5080 vastly improves performance as usual, but that's not a reasonable option in this game. Although this one copes better than Mafia II, it does still totally change the experience. AMD players have lived with this reality for over a decade now. But now NVIDIA's own customers, for those who play older games, get to experience vendor lockout. Out of curiosity, we also ran a hardware info log during a pass of the Last Light benchmark with the paired 5080 and 980. For the 5080, core load and Hardware Info's D3D usage metric had a near 1-to-1 correlation, and for the 980, core load and the compute_0 usage metric had a similar correlation. Plotting those two against each other reveals the point at which the PhysX effects kick in, with the 5080's usage dropping over the course of the benchmark as the workload bottlenecks elsewhere, while the 980's usage rises at the same time. The 5080's bus load was maxed out during the whole bench run, which makes some sense given the reduction in PCIe lanes. Mirror's Edge is the oldest game on our list. It's actually one of my favorite games from that era. I played a lot of the time trials. There aren't many graphics options in this one, and PhysX is a simple on or off toggle. But the graphics load in Mirror's Edge was absolutely brutal for its time, with glass breaking in particular causing major problems for hardware that couldn't handle it. Natively, the game is capped at 62 FPS. We were forced to edit the config file to uncap the frame rate for testing, which would reportedly lead to a soft lock later in the game. This is another game where just turn PhysX off is a potential argument, even though we don't agree with it. We'd argue that the PhysX version of the game is superior, with lots of broken glass, fog, and fabric. That's frequently completely missing with the setting off, but the PC version with added PhysX was only released a couple months after the original console launch. Here's the chart. The built-in Mirror's Edge flyby bench was inadequate, so we selected a simple bench path that includes breaking glass, which seems to be the major trigger for poor performance in this title. The 580 outperformed the 5080 when GPU accelerated PhysX ran on the 580 to the 5080 CPU PhysX. Although the average frame rate was roughly tied, the lows on the 5080 FE indicate huge problems with frame time pacing that ruin the experience. Just like Mafia II, the run-to-run variance was extremely high with CPU PhysX on both the 5080 and 580. The solo GTX 980 beat the 5080 by 36%, which isn't the way those numbers are supposed to go. The 5080 and 980 pairing beat the solo 5080 by 276%, with significantly improved lows, and the experience is a lot better. The retired press from the PhysX era can all finally say, "I told you so." Of the charted results, the paired card scored the best. The 5080 with PhysX disabled showed 475% uplift, but that's at the cost of removing PhysX items from the scenery. And even with PhysX off, the 5080's lows were weak. As with Mafia II, GPU accelerated PhysX performed significantly better on the 580 than CPU PhysX. Another possible indication of kneecapped CPU performance in the older PhysX versions is what we just looked at. Borderlands 2 is up next. We've confirmed that the low setting for PhysX in Borderlands 2 turns off all visible effects, so we're labeling that setting as PhysX off on the chart. PhysX effects include debris, cloth, particles, and smoothed particle hydrodynamics, or SPH fluid. We maxed out the settings and set PhysX to high when enabled. Borderlands 2 appears to gray out the PhysX option when no compatible card is detected, but this doesn't actually affect the setting. It just stops you from adjusting it without manually editing the config file, so great job, developers. Borderlands 2 contains a built-in PhysX test scene that's accessible with some light modding. This offers a good overview of how the game copes with a lack of PhysX. Some liquid and cloth is replaced with flat textures. Some completely disappears. and Sparks and Rubble are completely eliminated. As with the other titles we've tested, just turn PhysX off isn't acceptable advice. It's a huge part of the game's visuals, and it's what NVIDIA and this game used in its marketing. AMD users of the era, once again, can finally feel heard and vindicated. Here's the chart. The 5080 avoided landing at the absolute bottom of the chart here, but this is a more CPU-friendly PhysX 2.8.4 title, as we can see from the fact that CPU PhysX on the 580 scores higher than GPU acceleration on the same card. Still, the 980 with GPU acceleration outperformed the 5080 by 7%, and we even used the 5080 with all of its ROPs there. The 5080 plus 980 combination failed to launch at all in this title and isn't included on this chart. Turning PhysX off gained 447% performance for the 5080 with an average of 518 FPS, but again, that's not an option anyone should recommend. You should be able to play a game from 13 years ago on a 5080 without disabling core features. Batman is up next. Other Arkham games would have worked, but we picked Arkham City since it's a little newer than Asylum. In Arkham City, PhysX handles newspapers, flags, ropes, fog, sparks, glass, and general destruction. We maxed out the settings with PhysX set to high when enabled. When we tried this with our 5080, the game noted that our performance would be reduced. It suggested installing a nice GTX 570 instead, with a GTX 460 as a dedicated PhysX card, which it accurately says would be an upgrade from our 5080. And you could just do that. You could go buy a used older card if you're an enthusiast of these games but want 50 series hardware. The game has a built-in benchmark that features heavy use of PhysX in several scenes, and we logged performance for the entire duration across all of them. Unfortunately, the scenes are relatively short and have black loading screens in between, which normally would artificially inflate the frame rates. Examining our frame time plots, though, which we won't bother showing here, but showed us that the black screens caused frame time spikes rather than dips, but they were relatively short. For a more serious review, not that a benchmark using a 980 and a 5080 in the same system to test a 14-year-old game isn't serious, we'd never log across loading screens like this, but for this one, it just didn't really matter. The benchmark makes it very clear that PhysX is necessary to see the game as it was intended to be seen, especially the segment where display cases break and shower the floor with glass that's completely absent without PhysX. There was serious stuttering on all GPUs other than the GTX 580. That could either be because the frame rates are far above what the developers planned for, or because the 580 used a different driver than the rest. The 5080 is off to a promising start here with a 152 FPS average, giving it a 73% advantage over the GTX 980's GPU accelerated result. However, we can also see that going from PhysX on to off with the 5080 resulted in a 248% performance boost to 529 FPS, while the same change on the 980 only increased performance by 59% up to 140 FPS. That's because the 980 is processing PhysX on board, while the 5080 necessitates running it on our 9800X3 instead, which is a huge bottleneck. The 580 results are also interesting, with the PhysX CPU result actually 12% ahead of the PhysX GPU result. As we mentioned, this is a PhysX 2.8.4 title that may make use of the more CPU-friendly SSE2 instruction set, so it makes some sense that the CPU performance isn't completely abysmal. The Arkham City graphics menu recommends running a secondary card as a dedicated PhysX processor, which is exactly what we did with our 5080 and 980 test. Ignoring the stuttering issues, this was the best result on the chart, allowing us to enable PhysX effects while averaging 215 FPS. It shouldn't be a surprise that, of all the cards dating from 2025 to 2010, the 2025 card is the best, but it is, and only when paired with the 2014 card. That's a 41% uplift gained by adding in an 11-year-old graphics card. In terms of frame time consistency, the winner is the 580. So now the kind of reality check. It's not the biggest deal in the world that games from 12 to 15 years ago don't run on these modern GPUs. That's not really the core complaint here. Something we wanted to explore. Certainly a lot of people care about that sort of thing and should know about it, but that's not the big problem. It's not I mean, there's a lot worse controversies right now for NVIDIA's 50 series than that list of games. The real problem comes from everything that's sort of attached to it. And the concern we have is the broader issue, which is that NVIDIA has a habit of trying to come up with some kind of exclusive graphics tech for games, and it's the exclusive part that's key there. For example, RTX-specific ray tracing features and other stuff like DLSS, MFG, 3D Vision, Ansel, TXAA, Waveworks, MFAA, DLAA, HBAO+, Reflex, and Hairworks. Actually, you know what? That one's okay. We're okay with that one. But you get the point. This drags the industry along in NVIDIA's wake, and then when they get bored of the technology and abandon it, the customer's left holding the bag. Now, that's NVIDIA's prerogative as the eternal market leader. But it doesn't feel any better for those of us suckers with 3D vision monitors and glasses in the attic. And I actually did like 3D vision. But it's interesting because NVIDIA's making decisions on graphics. That's not all that controversial. They're a graphics company. There's things that they know how to do better than game developers. So some of this makes sense, like embedding engineers with game developers to teach them how to optimize things or bake in settings. So that's not necessarily the problem. The problem is, once again, the implementation and kind of what this PhysX 32-bit situation gives us as a warning against all this other special technology in the future from now. And it is not necessarily an antitrust issue to decide to use power and resources and know-how to then try and force improvements in graphics or make game development easier in a way that benefits the technology provider that's in that position. However, it can become one depending on how NVIDIA wants to execute on that vision. And that needs to be carefully monitored as NVIDIA maintains that 90-10 in the market. The bigger problem today is just that this move came as an unexpected, to us, side effect of the removal of 32-bit CUDA support in new cards, which appears to have blindsided everyone and could have other downstream effects beyond PhysX. For example, Passmark recently noted that 5090 and 5080 compute performance was unexpectedly low in benchmarks due to OpenCL 32-bit support breaking without warning. This is also an issue related to games preservation, kind of like you see with Stop Killing Games, except it's for a different reason than that. Same kind of idea though. It's very likely that some of these games could be tweaked to run better with CPU PhysX by swapping DLLs or otherwise modding them. But we can't take it for granted that some genius on a forum will always be there to clean things up, and that's not the point anyway. You could spend thousands of dollars on a brand new NVIDIA GPU and in the best case scenario, still have to do extra work to get those games to play properly with NVIDIA's own abandoned feature. We don't have a decisive call to action here. NVIDIA could probably fix PhysX, we think. There's probably a lot of reasons that would be difficult, a waste of time to them, or undesirable, but we're willing to bet a $3 trillion market cap, that NVIDIA has an engineer who could figure out how to get Borderlands 2 to run at a stable frame rate on a 50 series GPU. In the long term, this feels like a grim omen for any NVIDIA special feature that's integrated into a game, especially if it's core to how that game feels. Like what we were talking about in these games. They become different games. They're visually and experientially different when you play them without PhysX. It's a big feature. And even with newer PhysX games, I mean, we seriously doubt that Fallout 4 is the only half-assed implementation of 64-bit PhysX. So, games that are 12 or 15 years old, maybe not the biggest deal in sort of the microscopic situation that they're in, except for the people who really care about those games. There's ways to work around it. You can do accelerator cards. Kind of sucks, though, to go buy, like someone on Reddit did, a 5090, and then buy an RTX 3050 so you can play old games. But that's what was happening. And this is one of those where 10, 15 years in the future, we don't know if features like Reflex, MFG, again, even ray tracing will work the way they do today on the hardware that will be current in the future versus the stuff from the era they were developed. That's just sort of the nature of hardware. Sometimes, I mean, compatibility mode's been a thing for ages. And so we're trying to keep perspective here on just how big of an issue is this. But it does come back to NVIDIA and how much they push these specific technologies. And ray tracing in particular is an interesting one because it seems like it'll probably go through a paradigm shift that's major at some point just because it is still relatively new, but who knows. Anyway, that's it. That's the 32-bit PhysX feature. Hopefully you had fun getting some of the history on it. And if nothing else, it is kind of fun to see the GTX 580 and 980 come out of retirement. That's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to support us directly or patreon.com/gamersnexus to throw a few bucks our way each month as we continue to research and test all these different topics that are emerging right now. And we'll see you all next time.